Hey everyone, and welcome back. If you're a UPSC aspirant burning the midnight oil for those mains and prelims, this one's for you. We're diving deep into the Maharashtra Slum Areas Act of 1971.
Oh, a timely one for sure.
Yeah, it's been making headlines.
It has, and especially with the Supreme Court kind of pushing the Bombay High Court to review the act, there are definitely some concerns about how it's actually working, you know? And that has implications for everyone, from those who make policy to the people who actually live in these areas.
Yeah, because I think we hear about slum redevelopment, but what does that actually look like? What is this act all about?
Well, so the Maharashtra Slum Areas Act essentially gives the state government the power to declare an area as a slum and then potentially acquire that land, for redevelopment. It's really about setting that legal foundation to transform these areas.
So the government comes in and says, okay, this is officially a slum. We're going to work on this.
Exactly.
And is that where the Slum Rehabilitation Authority comes in, the SRA?
Right, the SRA. They're like the project managers for this whole thing.
Yeah.
They oversee the redevelopment, which usually means they're going to bring in private developers.
So it's not just the government doing the construction.
Not always, no. Often the SRA will work with private developers who put up the money for the redevelopment, and in return, they get benefits like, building more housing units and selling them.
Interesting. So there's a financial reason for developers to get involved. What about the people living there, though? What's the act promise them?
The main idea is that the people living in the slums get free housing in these new buildings. So it's meant to be win-win. Developers make a profit and people get better living conditions.
Okay, so that sounds good in theory. But the Supreme Court seems to have some reservations about how this is actually playing out. What are they worried about?
Well, the Supreme Court's pointed out several, I guess you could say, loopholes or gaps in how the act is actually being put into practice. One big concern is the potential for developers to have too much say in the decision-making. If they have too much influence, then, it raises questions about fairness and transparency.
Right. You wouldn't want the people making money off of this to have too much control over how it all happens. What else are they concerned about?
Another issue is that it's complicated to figure out who's officially considered a slum dweller. You'd think it's straightforward, but it can actually lead to all sorts of disagreements and legal issues, which just hold up the whole redevelopment project.
So you have people fighting over who actually gets the new housing. I can see how that would cause delays and tension.
Exactly. And then there's the whole question of those slum dwellers' cooperative societies. They're supposed to represent the residents and help choose developers, but the Supreme Court's worried that these societies can be, manipulated by the very developers they're supposed to be keeping in check.
So you have this potential power imbalance where the developers end up calling the shots, even though the system is supposed to give residents a voice.
Precisely. And that connects to another worry. The proportion of the new development that goes to the slum dwellers versus what the developers get to sell on the open market. The Supreme Court is concerned that the balance might be tipping too far towards profit and not enough towards making sure there's affordable housing.
Okay, so now we're seeing how this seemingly straightforward idea of slum redevelopment gets really complicated when you look at the details. It's not just about putting up new buildings. It's about navigating this whole web of competing interests and potential conflicts.
You've hit the nail on the head there. And there's a practical concern the Supreme Court brought up: transit accommodation.
What exactly is that?
Well, when a slum is being redeveloped, the people living there obviously need a place to stay while the construction is going on. The Act says they have to be provided with temporary housing, but there are concerns that this isn't always happening as smoothly as it should.
So potentially people are facing being moved around and a lot of uncertainty while they're waiting for their new homes.
Exactly. And the quality and even the availability of that temporary housing can be, very different from place to place. It's a big disruption to people's lives.
Sounds like the Supreme Court is really trying to make sure the act is used to genuinely help the residents and not just as a way for developers to get rich at their expense.
That's a fair assessment. And one last point on this. There's a broader concern about how independent and objective those statutory authorities are, the ones overseeing this whole process. The Supreme Court wants to make sure there's no bias or lack of accountability that could undermine the act's effectiveness.
Makes sense. If people lose trust in the system, the whole thing falls apart. Okay, so we've got a picture of the legal framework and some potential problems. But before we get even deeper into the challenges, can we zoom out for a second? For our listeners who might not be totally familiar with the realities of slums, what are we actually talking about? What makes a slum a slum?
That's a great question. We throw that word slum around a lot,
Mm.
but what does it actually mean? The UN, they define a slum as basically a rundown urban area. Substandard housing, poverty, and people not having secure tenure.
So it's not just about not having a lot of money, it's about lacking those basic standards of living and not even feeling secure in your own home.
Exactly. And this is a worldwide issue. It's not just in India. Over 1 billion people across the globe live in slums, and it's this trend of urbanization, people moving to cities for opportunity, but often ending up in these informal settlements.
Wow, that's a huge number. Imagine in India, with our cities growing so fast, slums are a major challenge.
Absolutely. Look at states like Maharashtra and Gujarat. They're attracting people from all over, which puts a huge strain on urban infrastructure and definitely contributes to more slums.
Okay, so you have this kind of mix of population growth, poverty, and then these regional differences, all kind of fueling this growth of slums. But let's get even more specific. What's it actually like to live in those conditions?
Hmm.
What challenges do people face beyond just not having a good place to live?
Well, you can imagine the challenges are pretty significant. Housing is just one part of it.
Right. It's not just a roof overhead. It's about having a safe and healthy place to live with dignity.
Exactly. And slums often just don't have basic sanitation or hygiene, which leads to huge health risks,
Yeah.
especially those waterborne diseases like typhoid and cholera.
It's like a vicious cycle, isn't it? Bad living conditions lead to health problems, which then trap people in poverty and make it even harder to escape.
You got it. And it's not just about physical health. There's also a much higher risk of exploitation in slums, especially for women and children. They might be forced into prostitution or begging, even child trafficking.
That's awful. We're talking about a lack of basic safety coupled with a lack of opportunities. It just paints a really bleak picture.
It does, sadly. And then you've got crime. Slums often have higher crime rates, and that's partly because of a lack of attention from the government, not enough police, limited access to education, and, those social services that could help break that cycle of poverty and violence.
It's almost as if neglect leads to more neglect. When you don't have those basic services and infrastructure, it just creates an environment where crime and exploitation can thrive.
That's often the case, unfortunately. It becomes this self-perpetuating cycle. And that's why this whole issue of slum rehabilitation is so important. But like we've been talking about, it's really complex and has its own set of challenges.
Right. We touched on those concerns the Supreme Court has, but it sounds like there's a whole other layer of complexity when it comes to actually putting these redevelopment plans into action. What kind of hurdles need to be overcome?
Well, one of the biggest is just acquiring the land and all the legal issues that go along with that. These projects often mean clearing out large areas of land, and that can lead to long legal battles and bureaucratic delays that just drag things out.
So even with good intentions, just getting the land and clearing it can be a major obstacle.
Absolutely. And then you've got the money issue. These projects require so much investment, and finding that funding can be a huge hurdle.
Now, I can imagine private developers might hesitate if the return on their investment isn't as good as other kinds of real estate projects.
That's often the case. So there's this constant tension between providing affordable housing and the financial reality of these huge development projects.
It's not just about building, it's about figuring out how to make it make financial sense as well.
Exactly. And let's not forget the human element here. Moving entire communities isn't just about bricks and mortar. It's about people's lives, their social networks, their sense of belonging.
You can't just uproot people without thinking about the impact on their society and culture. A slum, for all its problems, is still a community.
Absolutely. That's why getting the community involved is so crucial in these projects. But even when you do it right, there can still be resistance to moving. People might be afraid of losing those connections they've built, their livelihoods, their sense of place.
So it's not as simple as just offering people a nicer apartment. There were these deeper emotional and social ties at play.
Exactly. And then, of course, there are the environmental concerns.
Things like waste management and pollution, the need for green space.
Precisely. Slums are often located in areas that are environmentally sensitive, so redevelopment needs to be done in a way that doesn't make things worse. We can't just repeat those same unsustainable patterns that caused the problems in the first place.
Right, it's about building better, not just building more. Okay, so it sounds like slum rehabilitation is this incredibly complex thing with legal, financial, social, environmental, all these different dimensions. A lot to think about.
It really is. But even with all the challenges, there are some promising approaches and best practices coming out that can help us tackle this huge issue in a more effective and fair way.
Well, let's hear about them. I think our listeners are eager to learn about potential solutions.
One key area is definitely streamlining those legal frameworks for land acquisition. We need those processes to be more clear and fair compensation, faster dispute resolution. It's about getting rid of that red tape, but also making sure people's rights are protected.
Sounds like walking a tightrope a bit there.
Yeah.
What about the money side of things? We were talking about how it's tough to attract those big investments for these projects. Are there any kind of creative models out there that could help with that?
Absolutely. Public-private partnerships, those PPPs, can be a really good way to leverage both those public and private resources. Actually, the Mumbai Slum Rehabilitation Authority, the SRA model we talked about before, is an example of a PPP, though as we saw, it's got those flaws that need fixing.
Right. It's about finding models that work, but always tweaking them based on what actually happens, right? But beyond the money and legal stuff, you mentioned community engagement being super important. Can you say more about that? How you make sure that the people who live in these slums are actually shaping their own futures?
That's a really important question. It can't just be, token representation. It's about giving those residents a genuine voice in the planning. When people feel listened to, when they know their concerns matter, it builds trust and makes them less resistant to being relocated. A great example is the participatory slum upgrading program, the one from UN Habitat. They've had good results in a bunch of countries by using this approach where the communities and authorities actually work together.
So moving away from that top-down kind of approach and recognizing that the people living in these communities have their own expertise, their own insights, they know better than anyone what their needs and challenges are.
You're exactly right. And it's not just about listening. It's about using that local knowledge when you're designing and putting the project into action. That's how you create solutions that really fit the community and have a better shot at working in the long run.
That makes a lot of sense. You're more likely to get behind something that you helped create. Okay, so we've got legal frameworks, money models, community involvement. What about the environment? How do we make sure that slum redevelopment is done in a way that doesn't wreck the planet?
That's crucial. Absolutely. We've got to integrate eco-friendly practices in every single step of the project. Think sustainable building materials, energy efficiency, waste management, making sure we keep those green spaces. There's some really cool examples out there, like the Kathputli colony redevelopment in Delhi. They're using green building techniques, solar power, rainwater harvesting, all sorts of things.
Awesome. It's great to see that sustainability is becoming a key part of these projects. So to recap, we've got those clearer legal systems, new ways of getting funding, getting the community involved, and making sure it's good for the environment. Anything else we're missing? What's the glue that holds it all together?
The final piece, and probably the most important one, is good governance and transparency. We need institutions that are accountable, clear rules, and ways to track progress and deal with any problems that pop up.
So making sure the whole system is clean, efficient, and actually helps the people it's supposed to help. Accountability is key.
Exactly. One good example is Ahmedabad Slum Networking Project, the SNP. They've focused on building strong partnerships between those government agencies, NGOs, and the communities themselves. And that's led to more transparency and more success overall.
That's a great example of how collaboration and accountability can really make a difference. Okay, so we talked about a lot. The challenges of living in a slum, the complexities of the Maharashtra Slum Areas Act, and some potential solutions for making slum rehabilitation more effective and equitable. It's a lot to process, but it also feels kind of hopeful.
It is hopeful. These are complicated problems, but by learning from what's worked and taking that holistic approach, we can create urban environments that are more fair and sustainable for everyone.
Speaking of processing information, let's bring it back to our UPSC folks who are listening. We've covered so much today, from the legal stuff to the social issues to urban planning, governance. All of it is incredibly relevant for both the mains and prelims. What are the main takeaways our listeners should walk away with? What's going to help them nail those exams?
Well, first off, they got to have a solid understanding of the Maharashtra Slum Areas Act itself, know what it says, what it's supposed to do, and the problems with how it's being put into practice. That Supreme Court intervention is hot right now, so being able to break down those issues they pointed out, that'll definitely score you some points.
Right, because the UPSC isn't just looking for you to memorize things. They want to see you think critically, analyze policies and legal frameworks.
Exactly. Second, understanding what drives slum growth in India, and it's not just about poverty, it's about migration. Those regional differences, how cities are growing, even policy failures. Being able to see the connections between those social, economic, and political factors, that's what shows a deeper understanding.
So seeing that big picture, how all these different forces come together to create and sustain these slums.
Precisely. And third, being able to talk about all the different challenges faced by people who live in slums, that's key. It's more than just housing. It's health, sanitation, safety, education, jobs. It's about understanding the whole picture of what these communities need and how those needs are all tied together.
Because making policies isn't just about numbers and ideas. It's about people's lives and experiences.
Absolutely. And lastly, knowing the different ways we can approach slum rehabilitation is important. Understanding the legal stuff, the financial models, those community engagement strategies, environmental considerations, and probably the most important thing, recognizing how crucial good governance and accountability are for these projects to actually deliver.
So it's about being able to evaluate different solutions, seeing the trade-offs, and making smart recommendations based on a solid understanding of how complex all of this is.
Exactly. And keep in mind, this is just the start. The UPSC loves to see if you can think for yourself and connect the dots. So take this knowledge, dig deeper into specific examples, and stay up to date on what's happening in this field because it's always changing.
Great advice. And for our listeners who are prepping for the UPSC, remember that this deep dive was inspired by a recent article in the Indian Express. Always go back to that source, do your own research, form your own opinions. Now, before we wrap up, I have one last question for you and for our listeners to think about as they continue their UPSC journey. We talked about how difficult it is to relocate people from slums, but what about the ethics of development that pushes out whole communities, even if it's done with good intentions?
That's such an important question for anyone who wants to be a policymaker. How do we balance the need to improve our cities with the rights and well-being of those who might be displaced? Where do we draw that line between progress and social justice? These are tough, ethical questions that don't have easy answers.
It reminds you that progress isn't always a straight line, and that development often comes with a human cost. We have to be aware of those costs and work towards solutions that are effective but also fair.
You're right. Finding that balance, that's where the real challenge and the real reward lies. And that's what we as a society and you as future policymakers need to constantly strive for.
Well said. And on that note, folks, we're going to wrap up this episode. I want to thank everyone for joining us on this deep dive into a really complex and important issue. Whether you're studying for the UPSC or you're just someone who wants to understand how our cities work, we hope this has been insightful for you.
It's been great sharing this conversation with you all. We encourage you to keep asking those questions, stay curious, and work towards a better, more inclusive future for everyone.
And don't forget, everything we talked about today was based on that recent article in the Indian Express. So go check out that source, do your own digging, form your own opinions.
Exactly. Thinking critically and doing that independent analysis, those are essential skills for anyone who wants to make a real impact.
If you enjoyed this deep dive and found it helpful for your UPSC prep, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and leave us a comment below. We love hearing from you, and it helps us make more content that's relevant to you.
And if you've got any questions about the Maharashtra Slum Areas Act or anything else related to the UPSC exam, just ask away in the comments. We'll do our best to answer them.
That's all for today, folks. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and keep diving deep into those issues that matter.
Yeah, it really makes you think that policymaking isn't just about coming up with those technical solutions. It's about dealing with these really complicated human realities and those ethical questions.
It's about finding that balance, right?
Yeah.
Between what the city as a whole needs and the rights and well-being of the people who are most vulnerable.
Absolutely. And sometimes development means that there's a cost, and we have to make sure that those who can least afford it aren't the ones paying the price.
It's a good reminder that a city's progress isn't just about how much money it makes or how many fancy buildings it has. It's about how it treats those communities that are often overlooked.
Well said. And that's where the role of a civil servant is so important. You're not just putting policies in place, you're actually shaping society and affecting people's lives.
So for all of you out there who are hoping to be IAS officers, remember that you're not just studying for an exam. You're getting ready to lead and make a real difference in the lives of so many people. This deep dive into the Maharashtra Slum Areas Act is just one example of the tough challenges you'll face, but it also shows the huge opportunity you have to create positive change.
I couldn't agree more. Keep that in mind as you hit the books, analyze those case studies, and think big about the India you want to build.
Okay, folks, before we wrap up, I want to thank everyone for joining us on this deep dive. Whether you're a UPSC aspirant or just someone who wants to understand more about how our cities develop, we hope you found this episode insightful and thought-provoking.
It's been a pleasure being a part of this conversation with all of you. Keep those questions coming, stay curious, and keep working towards a better and more inclusive future for everyone.
And remember, the information and insights we discussed today were inspired by a recent article in the Indian Express. We always encourage you to go back to that source, do your own research, and come to your own conclusions.
Absolutely. Thinking critically and analyzing things on your own, those are essential skills for anyone who wants to make a real difference.
Well, if you enjoyed this deep dive and found it helpful for your UPSC preparation, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave us a comment below. We love hearing from you, and it helps us make content that's relevant to your needs and goals.
And if you have any questions about the Maharashtra Slum Areas Act or any other topic related to the UPSC exam, please feel free to ask away in the comments section. We'll do our best to answer those questions.
That's it for today's episode. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and keep diving deep into those issues that matter.